All right, thanks for joining everyone. Welcome to today's 10-minute webinar on Controlled Lighting 101. Presenting today will be Tim Mao, the Applications Engineering and Technical Support Manager at X-Ray. I'm Robert Grotans, the Global Technical Marketing Manager, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Just a few things to go over before we get started. Due to the number of people that are attending today's webinar, we will keep everyone muted. If you have a question, please use the questions function on the GoToWebinar panel, and Tim will have some time at the end to answer a few of them. Finally, this webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a link so that you can review the webinar at your convenience. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim to kick things off.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Look forward to spending a few minutes together talking about lighting. We've entitled this session Controlled Lighting 101, kind of an intro, but we're going to talk a bit more than about, a bit more than just lighting, hence the subtitle there of Get Your Visual Assessment Right. So let's dive in. To start with, I want to talk just for a moment about why lighting is so important to color. You know, we may have this little nook in a living room or a den or in your house somewhere, a place you love to sit. In my house, it'd be a place my wife is sitting to either read a book or knit or something like that, right? And it might look like that because she was the last one to buy light bulbs, and she bought those nice warm white lights. Well, me being a color guy, if she sends me to go buy new light bulbs, I don't tend to buy warm white ones. I tend to buy cool white ones. And so if I buy a cool white one and we put it in the lamp in the same room, you can see that that different lamp, that different light inside the lamp, I should say, a different source, makes the color look different. Now, if we change everything in the room, no problem. But if I've got two lamps and one of them's warm white and one of them's cool white, it's going to make things look a little funny, obviously. We've all seen that in a room. And then, oh, by the way, we open up the blinds and now we've got some daylight flowing in. And so we're looking at a picture of the exact same setting, three different light sources going on, and just the color of the back of the walls, the chair, the brass part of the lamp, all of those things change dramatically. And it's just a good visual for why lighting is really so important to us in color. We're going to see some other things similar to this as we go on, as we talk more in depth about that. And so why our standard procedures matter? Why do they really make a difference? And it goes back to kind of the previous slide, why lighting is so important to color, right? There are essentially three elements of color, or color happens because, due to these three things. The first is light, as we've been talking. It's got to be a source, might be a CFL, might be the sun, might be a candle, or anything else, right? Now that light needs to interact or shine on an object. Here we got a stack of cups of different color. And so the light interacts with the object, and then ultimately, in order for color to occur, somebody has to be there to see it, an observer. When we talk about instrumentation, that can take the place, but today we're talking about visual assessment and lighting. So we've got to have light, we've got to have an object, we've got to have an observer. And the standard procedures that come into play here when we're talking about doing visual assessment of color ties into this, that controlling and validating both the light and the observer is absolutely critical. Those two pieces we have to control. Why do we need to control them? Because we need the object to be the only variable. Otherwise, we can have two objects. You know, typically if you're doing a visual assessment, you're looking at an object and comparing it to a target or a standard. If I'm doing that and there is variation going on with the light or variation going on with an observer, and we'll talk about that in more depth, if those two things are having variables in them, then they may be telling me that two objects that are identical in color aren't. And so we don't want any false positives in our assessment. We want the object to be the only variable. So these procedures are very important. Let's talk a little bit more about how we deal with those two pieces, the light and the observer. So first, the lighting. We saw that in the pictures of the chair and the table and the lamp, that different sources provide different results. So I'm going to show you a similar thing. This is a picture of an actual light booth. Happens to be a Spectralite QC light booth with what's called a color checker. That's that rectangular thing with all the little color swatches in it. That's used for calibrating cameras and those kinds of things. So we've taken a picture and then we've literally just turned on different lights. So we just went from having a daylight illuminate turned on to TL84, which is a kind of fluorescent light, to an incandescent light. And again, we can see the difference here. It's a bit more controlled than looking at a picture of a room. When I show this to people, I tend to have them look just at the bottom row of swatches in that color checker. On the left, under daylight, right, it's very white to black and neutral grays. A little less neutral maybe under TL84, and then when we go to incandescent, it's not grays anymore. It looks like a series of like khaki colors and those kinds of things. So different sources give us different results. Okay, so we've got to make sure we get the results, get the source that we're using right. And of course, if I'm looking at it under daylight and I say the color looks good, and my customer who I'm shipping it to is looking at it under TL84, he might get a different answer, right? So we've got to be sure that we're communicating and we're very, very precise about what light source we're using. Also important that those light sources are calibrated and certified, meeting CIE standards. So CIE is the sanctioning body, if you will, in the world for what a light source means. So I'm going to replace these pictures with how the CIE would define a light source. So daylight, one of the daylight light sources, they would define as this. This is called spectral power distribution. Essentially, we're looking at how much of each color of the spectrum is inside that light. So daylight looks like that. TL84 looks like that. You can see it's got some very strong narrow peaks and some very deep valleys in it. And then incandescent light looks like that. And so it's very obvious why things might look different under different light sources when they have different amounts of the colors in them. So the critical part here is not only that you have, again, in the scenario of you're looking at the color and your customer's looking at the color, that you're both looking under the same light source, but that they're calibrated and certified, because otherwise they might be labeled as daylight. I guarantee you, if you go to your local hardware store or big box store and buy light bulbs that say these are daylight light bulbs, they don't have that spectral power distribution in them. Right? You have to buy special bulbs in a light booth and have them calibrated and certified to ensure you're meeting those standards. Otherwise, we're introducing a variable. So that's how we go about managing and controlling the lighting. It's equally important that we deal with the operator. Why? Because we all see color differently. We're individual people. We have different vision. Some of us are affected by color blindness. In men, it's 1 in 13 men. That's 8.5% of the population, male population, is colorblind, which means if someone who is colorblind looks at these two circles of dots, they can't see the numbers that are in them. Hopefully you can, if you're looking at these, and again, apologies because showing them over a WebEx kind of situation, the color might not be the best, but you should be able to make a 6 out of the one on the left and either a 2 or an 8 out of the one on the right, depending upon whether you see a 2 or an 8 has something to do with some of your color sensitivity. We won't go into the detail of that, but there are tests for color blindness. There are also tests for color deficiencies, and testing is critical because we can't just assume someone knows how to see color and that their vision never changes. As we age, our vision does indeed change, so we have to be aware of that. And so how do we go about doing the testing? We want to test color acuity, someone's ability to assess color. Best way to do that, it's ISO, meets ISO specs. You can ISO certify someone for a year for being a color assessment person. using the Farnsworth-Munsell hue test, or what we call FM100, which is essentially 4 trays of little circles of color. You can see they slowly gradiate, if you will, from on the top one from a greenish yellow on the right to a kind of a peachish color on the left. The way you do those tests is all the little circles in between the far ends would be set and mixed up in a light booth, and then somebody has to put them back in order as best they can. You do that with each of the 4 trays, and then in doing so, you actually can classify and rate an observer for how well they see color. So this would represent someone who had superior color vision. What we're looking at is all of the different swatches that they looked at, and then there's basically a circle with some lines that get out of a tight circle in the middle. Those lines where they pop out like that are indications where that person had 1 or 2 or 3 things switched. They had 2 of those colors in the opposite position of where they should have been. This would be someone with superior vision. There are people who score perfect, who get everything right with excellent color vision. There are also people who have low discrimination who literally would get a result like this. And so this person has really good color vision in the red to purple range and in the green range, but they have horrible color vision in the yellow and blue areas. Obviously, depending upon what colors you're assessing, this person might not be suitable to be doing color vision. But again, this ability to do a test, it's got software that comes with where you can test someone, validate that they see color well, or there are many companies out there who do this kind of routine testing on a yearly basis, print out a certificate, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, enough about the product. It's about being able to know that the operator can see color properly. So if we control those 2 variables, then we've got some best practices to throw in. One is about how we put samples in a light booth. So maybe the most important one. There's 2 ways to do it. Positioning the sample flat, in other words, laying it on the surface of the booth, or parallel perpendicular to the luminaire, which is the actual lights. Okay. The other way that we see people is that do it is they may position the sample at a 45-degree angle. So they've got something that's holding the sample at a 45-degree angle. Either of those 2 methods will work and be repeatable, but there's a caution. If you use the second one, the one on the right, you got to be careful because observers with different heights will end up with a different angle between the sample and their eye. So if you have someone who's 6'5" and you have someone who's 5'2", both look at that same sample, they're going to be looking at it at different angles, which will change the color, will change things. So in practice, what we see is people are either using the method on the left, or if they're using the one on the right, they may be, I've actually seen customer locations where they have a set of different stools that people stand on to get everybody's eyes at essentially the same level so that the angle is the same for everyone. That's a very important piece to making sure that you're repeatable. And then ultimately the goal is avoiding this, right? You've got under TL84, my sample 1 and my sample 4, they don't match really well. Depends on what it is you're producing. Some people might say that's an awful match. Some people might say that's acceptable. The one on the right's a little bit less green than the one on the left, let's say. But these are the exact same 2 samples then in incandescent light, and obviously we wouldn't even call the one on the right a green anymore. It's now a brown, right? We're trying to avoid metamerism. So metamerism is the situation where 2 colors match on one set of conditions or under one set of lights. And when we put them under a different set of lights, they don't match anymore. That's the biggest burn, if I can use that word, you can have when you're doing visual assessment if your way of assessing things does not match your customers. And it's really, really easy and very, very common for people, wherever they are, when they have a color standard and a color sample, to look at them under whatever light they're sitting in their office, in a production facility, whatever. And if that light's not controlled, then that assessment is not valid and may lead you to a situation like this that we're trying to avoid. All right, we actually went over a couple of minutes of trying to hit our 10-minute window. So we are ready to answer any questions that you may have about this. Be more than happy to answer any questions. I've got one that I'll address right off the bat, and if as I'm talking you come up with others, please feel free to submit them. Question was, what about a light room, not a light booth? So essentially, the way lighting works is it can be a booth. We have them of various sizes. They're available to, for smaller sizes that would fit in an office, or a smaller lab, larger sizes. But there's also the ability to take the top portion of that booth, what we call the luminaire, and hang it in a room, right? Maybe you have very, very large things that you need to assess color for. So that can be done quite easily. The luminaires can be hung. We actually would give you a recommendation of what color to paint things, because you want everything to be neutral and a nice solid, what's called Munsell N7, neutral gray, so that it doesn't affect your color vision. So that's easily doable to fit whatever size samples you may need to be assessing. One other question I see here, what about viewing the sample straight up and down and not at an angle? That's a problem relative to the way that the light is hanging. If we're talking about in a booth, obviously the light is perpendicular or shining straight down onto the bottom of the table, if you will, shining onto the table, or the work surface. If I stand my sample up, I'm going to see a lot of gloss, for one thing, because the light's coming straight down and essentially running perpendicular to the sample instead of actually shining on the sample. So we would not recommend that be used as a method. Now, there are reasons to put a sample in a light booth, look at it one way, and then tip it, right, at different angles. For example, if what you're assessing is a metallic kind of color that changes color as you use, as the color changes based on viewing angle. So like metallic finish, like you'd see in your car, it may change as you move from one angle to the next, right? That is a reason to want to look at it at different angles. For the most part, we want to maintain one. And then one last question, someone asked whether or not we have stands for the light booth for a 45-degree angle. We don't. Typically what we recommend is, it's something that's pretty simple to get, your maintenance people or engineering people to provide for you. The reason we don't do them is because there are very different needs depending upon what kind of samples you're putting into the booth, to try and put them at a 45. Another way that people address that is if they don't use a booth and they're using a light room, they might actually have the work surface in the room at a 45-degree angle. They might hang the lights at an angle rather than flat. So you get a lot more flexibility once you expand to that. So lots and lots of ways for us to use light. I'm not able to get to every question because I'm getting lots of good ones. I do promise you that I will reach out to anybody whose question I didn't answer, and we will get back to you via email and give you a response. One last comment, just because I saw a question pop up. I didn't even read the whole question, but I just saw LED. Yes, the world is moving to LED lights. The CIE has defined LED illuminance, or spectral power distribution, and we do have an LED light kit to allow you to put certifiable CIE meeting LED lights into a booth. The scary part there is that, of course, the LED lights you go buy somewhere to put in a room wildly vary all over the place, and so that's a caution. There's like 20 LED light illuminants defined by CIE, but we do have the ability to include LED. So with that, as I said, I will reach out to anybody who left a question and make sure that we give you a full answer. Thank you all for joining us today. And as Robert mentioned, you'll get an email with a link to the recording of this webinar. Thank you for your time and your interest in X-ray.
Thank you, everyone.